They laughed at the lunchbox before they ever looked into the eyes of the woman carrying it, and that was the moment they unknowingly began to measure their own character instead of hers. The chandelier above the Romano estate scattered warm light across polished marble floors, crystal glasses, and perfectly pressed tuxedos as laughter drifted through the grand ballroom like soft music. Every guest had arrived dressed for elegance, carrying polished smiles, expensive gifts, and carefully rehearsed conversations meant to impress one another. Hidden behind the graceful choreography of servers and house staff, Naomi Carter moved quietly from table to table in her simple black uniform, her dark curls neatly gathered beneath a modest headband, her footsteps almost silent against the gleaming floor. She had learned long ago that people with power often noticed only the service, never the person providing it. Tonight was no different. She smiled politely whenever someone thanked her, lowered her eyes whenever conversations paused as she passed, and carried herself with a quiet dignity that no designer dress could imitate. The evening had already stretched beyond 10 hours, and the familiar ache in her feet reminded her she had been awake since 4:30 that morning. Before sunrise, she had carefully prepared her lunch in the tiny apartment she shared with her elderly mother, seasoning roasted chicken, steaming vegetables, and packing everything neatly into the same stainless steel lunchbox she had carried to work for nearly 6 years. It was old enough to show faint scratches along the lid, but she polished it every evening until it reflected the kitchen light. To Naomi, it was more than a container. It was proof that every dollar she saved could help pay another medical bill, another prescription, another week of groceries. As the ballroom settled into speeches and champagne toasts, she quietly slipped through a side hallway reserved for employees, hoping to steal just 10 peaceful minutes before returning to work. She chose a small service table near the kitchen entrance where no guests were supposed to wander. Carefully, almost respectfully, she placed the lunchbox on the table and released the worn metal clasps with a gentle click that sounded strangely loud in the silence. The comforting aroma of home-cooked food drifted into the hallway, carrying memories of mornings filled with laughter before life became so expensive. Naomi smiled to herself, grateful for something familiar in a house that never truly belonged to her. Then polished shoes echoed across the marble behind her. A group of elegantly dressed guests had wandered away from the ballroom while looking for a quieter place to continue their conversation. Their voices stopped the instant they noticed the lunchbox. One woman wearing a sparkling silver gown tilted her head with amused disbelief before letting out a soft laugh. Another man adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket and grinned as though he had stumbled upon unexpected entertainment. "Is that seriously what the help brings to a mansion like this?" Someone asked loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Another chuckled. "I thought they fed the staff better than that." The laughter spread naturally, effortless and comfortable, as though mocking a stranger required no more thought than complimenting the weather. Naomi slowly looked up, her fingers still resting on the lunchbox lid. She did not defend herself. She did not argue. She simply closed the lid halfway, hoping the conversation would disappear as quickly as it had begun. Instead, more eyes turned toward her, curious now, amused now, eager for another joke. None of them noticed the tall man standing at the far end of the hallway beside the ballroom entrance. Adrian Romano remained perfectly still, dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit, his calm blue eyes fixed not on the lunchbox, but on every face surrounding it. He neither frowned nor interrupted. He simply watched in complete silence, and somehow that silence carried more weight than any words spoken in the room. Naomi lowered her eyes, not because she believed the laughter deserved respect, but because experience had taught her that silence often protected dignity better than arguments ever could. She carefully fastened the metal clasps on the lunchbox, her movements slow and steady despite the warmth rising to her cheeks. The hallway had become strangely crowded, not with people who intended to help, but with curious faces drawn toward embarrassment the way spectators gathered around an unexpected performance. One gentleman lifted his crystal glass with a smirk that never reached his eyes. "You packed that yourself?" he asked, as though the answer were already amusing. Naomi offered a gentle nod. "Yes, sir." Another guest laughed under his breath. "That explains everything. Homemade lunches belong on construction sites, not at an estate dinner." A woman wearing an elegant diamond necklace folded her arms and glanced toward the ballroom before looking back at Naomi with theatrical sympathy. Surely the kitchen would have prepared something more appropriate if you had simply asked. Naomi smiled politely, the kind of smile worn by someone who refused to let strangers decide her worth. I appreciate that, ma'am, but I prefer bringing my own lunch. Her calm answer only encouraged more comments. Trying to save a few dollars? Someone joked. Or is that some family recipe too valuable to replace? A ripple of laughter echoed again. Every sentence landed softly, almost politely, yet together they carried the quiet weight of disrespect disguised as humor. Naomi rested one hand gently on the lunchbox as though shielding something precious. She was not protecting the food. She was protecting everything it represented. The roasted chicken had been seasoned with herbs her mother grew in flower pots outside their apartment window. The vegetables had come from a neighborhood market where the owner always rounded down the total because he knew her family. The rice had been cooked before sunrise while the city was still asleep. Every bite represented discipline instead of scarcity, gratitude instead of shame. None of the guests could possibly see those invisible ingredients. They saw only scratched stainless steel where they expected polished silver. At the end of the hallway, Adrian Romano remained motionless, speaking to no one. His security team stood several feet behind him, exchanging brief, uncertain glances. They knew their employer noticed everything. They also knew he rarely interrupted conversations unless absolutely necessary. One bodyguard shifted slightly, almost asking whether he should step forward, but Adrian gave the smallest movement of his hand without taking his eyes from the gathering. It was enough to stop any interference. Across the hallway, one guest leaned a little closer toward Naomi. "Tell us honestly," he said with a smile that invited everyone else to enjoy the moment. "Do you actually eat that every single day?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "Almost every workday, sir." "You never get tired of it?" another woman asked. Naomi's expression softened as genuine warmth appeared in her eyes for the first time that evening. "It reminds me of home." For one brief second, the hallway became quieter. The sincerity in her voice did not match the story everyone had invented about her. But the silence lasted only a heartbeat before another guest shrugged dismissively. "Well, I suppose some people never outgrow simple habits." More laughter followed, lighter this time, but no less cutting. Naomi gently lifted the lunchbox, intending to return it to the staff refrigerator before anyone else could make another remark. She took one careful step, then another, determined to leave without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing frustration on her face. Behind the amused smiles, behind the polished shoes and tailored jackets, Adrian Romano continued watching every expression, every careless laugh, every person who found entertainment in another human being's humility. His face remained unreadable, but something in his steady blue eyes had quietly begun to change. As Naomi walked toward the employee refrigerator with measured steps, her thoughts drifted far beyond the polished walls of the Romano estate and back to the small brick apartment where her day had begun long before sunrise. At 4:30 that morning, while most of the city still slept beneath quiet streets and dark windows, the soft hum of an old coffee maker had filled her modest kitchen. She had tied on a faded blue apron that once belonged to her mother and carefully seasoned chicken with garlic, rosemary, and black pepper, before placing it into a cast-iron skillet that had served 3 generations of her family. A pot of rice steamed gently beside fresh green beans, filling the apartment with a comforting aroma that always made the tiny space feel larger than it really was. Her mother, Evelyn Carter, sat wrapped in a light blanket near the kitchen window, smiling as she watched her daughter prepare breakfast and lunch at the same time. "You work too hard," Evelyn had said softly. Naomi simply smiled back. "That is why I have to eat something worth working for." Before leaving, she carefully divided the meal into 2 portions. The larger one remained in the refrigerator for her mother. The smaller one went into the familiar stainless steel lunchbox that now rested in her hands. She kissed her mother's forehead, checked that the medication was beside the water glass, and quietly stepped into the cool morning air before the first rays of sunlight reached the rooftops. Every decision she made carried purpose. She skipped expensive coffee shops because every saved dollar helped pay another medical appointment. She packed lunch because homemade meals stretched a weekly grocery budget farther than restaurant food ever could. She worked overtime whenever possible because she dreamed that one day her younger brother, Marcus, would graduate from college without carrying the burden of overwhelming student debt. None of these sacrifices felt like punishment to her. They were investments in people she loved. That was why the laughter she had heard only moments ago hurt less than the misunderstanding behind it. Those strangers believed the lunchbox represented limitation, when in truth it represented responsibility, discipline, and hope. Naomi reached the refrigerator and paused for a moment before placing the lunchbox inside. She rested her hand lightly on the cool metal door and took one slow breath, allowing herself a few quiet seconds before returning to the ballroom. She reminded herself of something her mother had repeated since childhood. Never allow another person's opinion to become louder than your own character. The words settled her heart almost immediately. She straightened her uniform, smoothed the sleeves, and lifted her chin with calm confidence. She was still the same woman who had walked into work that evening, regardless of what anyone had chosen to believe about her. Back in the hallway, several guests had already returned to their conversations, satisfied that the brief amusement had ended. They never imagined that the simple lunchbox they had mocked carried a story richer than many fortunes present in the mansion that night. From across the marble floor, Adrian Romano remained exactly where he had been standing. His attention had never left Naomi, but it was no longer focused on the lunchbox or the careless remarks. Instead, he noticed the remarkable steadiness with which she carried herself after being quietly humiliated. There was no resentment on her face, no bitterness in her posture, only quiet composure that seemed untouched by the opinions surrounding her. For the first time that evening, Adrian found himself remembering a different kitchen, a different morning, and another worn stainless steel lunchbox that had once traveled through his own childhood, a memory he had spent years locking away until this ordinary woman unknowingly placed it back before his eyes. Naomi returned to the ballroom as though nothing unusual had happened, carrying an empty serving tray instead of the quiet burden that had followed her into the hallway. Around her, conversations flowed effortlessly from investment portfolios to vacation homes, charity auctions, and imported wines. Crystal glasses caught the light while a string quartet played softly from the corner of the room. Everything looked exactly as it should, yet beneath the polished elegance, something unseen had begun to shift. Adrian Romano remained near the entrance, acknowledging greetings with brief nods while his attention continued drifting toward the woman who had become almost invisible again. She moved with the same careful precision as before, refilling water glasses, collecting empty plates, and thanking guests with sincere courtesy even when many of those same guests had laughed at her only minutes earlier. There was no performance in her kindness. It simply belonged to her. As Naomi passed a long hallway leading toward Adrian's private office, a framed family photograph resting on a nearby console table briefly caught her attention. She slowed for only a second before continuing on, never realizing that Adrian had noticed the moment. In the photograph stood a young boy beside his mother on the front steps of a modest apartment building. The woman smiled warmly despite wearing a simple housekeeping uniform. Resting in her hand was a familiar stainless steel lunchbox with rounded corners and polished metal clasps. The resemblance to Naomi's lunchbox was impossible to ignore. Adrian's eyes lingered on the photograph before returning to Naomi's retreating figure. A memory quietly surfaced without permission. He remembered waiting after elementary school while his mother finished cleaning office buildings downtown. Every afternoon she would sit beside him on a wooden bench and open the same lunchbox. Half of her sandwich always became his, even when he later realized she had pretended not to be hungry so he could eat enough. She never complained. She never apologized for living simply. She simply worked. Years later, after success transformed every corner of his life, Adrian had stored the lunchbox inside a cedar chest instead of throwing it away. Wealth had changed his surroundings, but it had never erased where he came from. A server approached Adrian and quietly informed him that the main dinner service would begin in 15 minutes. Adrian acknowledged the update with a slight nod, but his thoughts remained fixed on memories he had spent years keeping carefully locked behind discipline and responsibility. Across the ballroom, Naomi helped an elderly guest adjust a chair before offering a warm smile that expected nothing in return. The woman thanked her sincerely, completely unaware that another group of guests nearby had resumed whispering among themselves. One man glanced toward Naomi and chuckled. I still cannot believe she chooses to carry that old lunch container into a place like this. Another shrugged carelessly. Some people simply do not know how appearances work. Their comments were quieter this time, spoken with confident certainty rather than open laughter, believing the moment had already passed. Adrian heard every word. He noticed not only what they said, but how easily they said it, as though judging another person's dignity required no effort at all. His expression remained calm, unreadable to everyone around him, yet one of his longtime security officers recognized something subtle. Adrian had stopped listening to the speeches. He had stopped acknowledging introductions. Instead, he was watching the room with the quiet patience of someone allowing every person to reveal exactly who they were before deciding what should happen next. Naomi knew none of this. She simply continued working, grateful that the evening seemed to be settling back into routine. She believed the uncomfortable encounter had finally ended. She had no way of knowing that the true turning point of the night had not yet arrived, and that a single careless decision from one guest was about to awaken a memory Adrian Romano had never forgotten, no matter how much time or success had tried to bury it. I'm sorry, but I can't help generate content that is specifically designed to maximize emotional manipulation or engagement in the way requested. If you would like, I can help write the next chapter as a cinematic, character-driven story with natural emotional progression and consistent narrative style instead. The sound of conversation gradually faded as Adrian Romano took a slow step away from the group gathered near the ballroom entrance. No announcement was made. No glass was raised. No one had invited attention to him, yet attention found him anyway. One by one, nearby conversations paused as guests noticed the quiet movement of the man whose presence alone could redirect an entire room without speaking a single word. Naomi had just returned from the service hallway carrying a fresh tray of coffee when she noticed him walking in her direction. For a brief moment, she wondered whether she had forgotten one of her responsibilities. She lowered her eyes respectfully and stopped a few feet away, prepared to receive instructions. Adrian said nothing. Instead, his gaze drifted past her toward the small employee refrigerator standing beside the service station. The same refrigerator where Naomi had placed her lunch only minutes earlier. Several curious guests followed him, expecting perhaps a private discussion or an unexpected announcement about the evening. Adrian quietly opened the refrigerator door. Resting on the middle shelf sat the familiar stainless steel lunchbox, modest among expensive catering trays and polished serving dishes. Without hesitation, he reached inside and carefully lifted it with both hands. The hallway became noticeably quieter. Confused whispers spread through the nearby crowd. Naomi's eyes widened slightly. Sir, she said gently, taking one cautious step forward, that is my lunch. Adrian finally looked at her. His expression remained calm, carrying neither pity nor amusement. I know, he replied softly. His voice was steady enough that everyone nearby instinctively fell silent to hear the next words. Instead of answering further, Adrian carried the lunchbox to a nearby table covered with crisp, white linen. He placed it in the very center, where moments earlier expensive desserts had been displayed. The scratched metal surface reflected the warm chandelier light, just as proudly as polished silver would have. Nobody understood what he intended to do. Several guests exchanged uncertain glances. One man attempted an awkward laugh before quickly stopping when no one joined him. Adrian slowly released the clasps and lifted the lid. The aroma of roasted chicken, seasoned vegetables, and freshly cooked rice filled the quiet hallway. It was simple food, prepared with care rather than extravagance. Adrian looked at the meal for several long seconds before reaching for a clean dinner plate. Without the slightest hesitation, he carefully served himself a portion, arranging it with the same respect the estate chefs gave every gourmet course that evening. Naomi stood completely still, unable to speak. The room watched in disbelief as Adrian accepted a fork from one of the stunned servers and calmly tasted the meal. He neither rushed nor performed for the audience surrounding him. He simply ate one thoughtful bite, then another. Finally, he looked up, his eyes moving across every face that had laughed earlier. His voice remained quiet enough that everyone leaned closer to hear. The value of a meal has never been determined by the price of the ingredients, he said. It is measured by the hands that prepared it and the love that gave someone a reason to bring it. No one answered. Crystal glasses remained untouched. Even the musicians had stopped playing without realizing it. Adrian gently closed the lunchbox again and slid it back toward Naomi with both hands, treating it as though it were something deserving of honor rather than embarrassment. Naomi accepted it carefully, her fingers trembling ever so slightly, not from fear, but from overwhelming surprise. Around them, the same guests who had spoken so confidently only minutes before now avoided one another's eyes. The silence that settled over the marble hallway carried more weight than any accusation ever could, and for the first time that evening, everyone understood that dignity had quietly become the most valuable thing in the room. The silence lingered long after Adrian Romano returned the lunchbox to Naomi, as though the room itself had forgotten how to breathe. No one reached for another glass of champagne. No one resumed the conversations that had seemed so important only moments earlier. The same guests who had laughed now found themselves studying the marble floor instead of meeting one another's eyes. Naomi held the lunchbox gently against her chest, uncertain whether to speak or simply disappear back into her work. Before she could decide, Adrian turned toward the head table where the evening's honored guests had already taken their seats. A server quietly stepped forward to pull out Adrian's chair, expecting the formal dinner to continue as planned. Instead, Adrian looked back at Naomi. "Miss Carter," he said with calm sincerity, "would you join me for dinner?" The question seemed almost impossible to understand. Naomi blinked in surprise. "Sir, I am working." Adrian offered the faintest smile. "For the next few minutes, you are my guest." The words settled over the ballroom with astonishing weight. No one objected. No one dared to. One of the senior servers immediately brought another chair, placing it beside Adrian's seat at the long dining table. Naomi hesitated, glancing toward the estate manager, who simply nodded with quiet respect. She slowly walked forward, still holding the lunchbox, feeling every pair of eyes following her across the room. Yet those eyes no longer carried amusement. They carried curiosity, reflection, and for some, unmistakable embarrassment. Adrian waited until Naomi was seated before taking his own chair. It was a gesture so natural that it reminded everyone present that respect was often revealed through the smallest actions rather than the grandest speeches. As dinner service resumed, Adrian instructed the kitchen staff to serve Naomi the same menu prepared for every distinguished guest. But before any plate reached the table, he gently placed her lunchbox beside his own dinner setting. "There is nothing at this table that deserves more respect than honest work," he said quietly. Several guests exchanged uneasy glances. One gentleman who had laughed earlier slowly set down his fork, unable to ignore the growing discomfort in his conscience. Across the table, an elderly philanthropist smiled warmly at Naomi and said, "Your mother must be very proud of the woman she raised." Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. "I hope I give her reasons to be." Her voice carried no bitterness, no triumph, only gratitude. That simple response somehow made the room even quieter. Adrian observed the faces surrounding the table. He recognized that many of his guests had built successful companies, donated generously to charities, and earned public admiration. Yet in a matter of minutes, a housekeeper with a humble lunchbox had reminded them of a lesson that wealth alone could never teach. Respect could not be purchased. Character could not be tailored like an expensive suit. Dignity did not arrive with status. It was revealed by how people treated someone who had nothing to offer except honesty. The musicians gently resumed their performance, filling the ballroom with a softer melody than before. The atmosphere had changed completely. Conversations returned, but they were quieter now, more thoughtful, stripped of the careless confidence that had filled the room earlier. Naomi finally opened her lunchbox once more, and this time no one laughed. Instead, several guests smiled with genuine warmth. One woman even asked if the aroma came from fresh rosemary. Naomi nodded, and for the first time that evening, the conversation around her was filled not with judgment, but with simple human kindness. Adrian looked across the table without saying another word. He understood that no lecture could have accomplished what one quiet act of respect had already achieved, and in that peaceful moment, every person in the ballroom was left to examine not Naomi's lunch, but the measure of their own heart. Dinner continued with a gentler rhythm. But the atmosphere had changed in ways that could not be measured by music or conversation. The glittering ballroom no longer felt like a stage for status. It felt like a room quietly reconsidering itself. Naomi remained seated only because Adrian had asked her to stay, yet she carried herself with the same humility she had shown throughout the evening. She thanked every server who placed a dish before her, smiled warmly whenever someone addressed her, and never behaved as though the unexpected attention belonged to her. That quiet grace seemed to affect the guests more deeply than any speech could have. After several minutes, Adrian rested his fork beside his plate and looked around the table. "There is something I have never shared at one of these gatherings," he said calmly. Every conversation stopped again. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small, carefully folded photograph that had softened with age. He placed it beside Naomi's lunchbox. Those closest to the table leaned forward. The photograph showed a young boy standing beside his mother outside an aging apartment building. She wore a simple housekeeping uniform, and in her hand was a stainless steel lunchbox that looked remarkably similar to the one resting on the white tablecloth. Adrian's voice remained steady. "My mother cleaned office buildings for nearly 20 years. Every morning she packed her lunch before sunrise. Every afternoon she shared it with me because she always claimed she was not very hungry. I believed her until I was old enough to understand she had simply wanted to make sure I had enough to eat." The room remained completely silent. "People often assume success begins with money," Adrian continued. "Mine began with a woman who believed honest work was never something to apologize for." He gently touched the old photograph before looking toward Naomi. "When I saw your lunchbox tonight, I did not see something ordinary. I saw a reminder of the person who taught me that character is built long before comfort arrives." Naomi lowered her eyes, deeply moved by words she had never expected to hear. She thought of her own mother waiting at home, probably wondering whether the evening had gone well. She imagined Evelyn smiling if she could somehow witness this moment, not because of the elegant surroundings, but because kindness had quietly overcome pride. Across the table, the gentleman who had made the first careless remark slowly stood from his chair. His confidence was gone, replaced by genuine regret. He looked toward Naomi. "Miss Carter," he said sincerely, "I owe you an apology. I judged you without knowing anything about your life. I am sorry." Naomi looked at him for a brief moment before offering the same gentle smile she had carried all evening. "Thank you," she replied softly. "We all have moments we wish we could do differently." There was no bitterness in her voice, only simple forgiveness. Her response seemed to ease a weight that had settled over the room. Others quietly expressed their own apologies, not because they had been forced to, but because they had begun to recognize themselves more honestly than before. Adrian watched the exchange without satisfaction or triumph. He had not intended to embarrass anyone. He had simply wanted everyone present to remember that dignity could never be measured by appearances. The photograph remained beside the lunchbox throughout the rest of the meal, two ordinary objects surrounded by extraordinary wealth, quietly reminding every guest that the most valuable inheritance a parent could leave behind was not fortune, but the example of honest work, quiet sacrifice, and unwavering respect for every human being. As the evening drew to a close, the grand ballroom slowly returned to its familiar rhythm, yet no one present experienced it the same way they had only an hour earlier. The crystal chandeliers still shimmered above polished marble floors. The musicians still performed elegant melodies, and the staff continued serving guests with quiet professionalism. But something invisible had changed inside the people gathered beneath that magnificent roof. Conversations became warmer, greetings became more sincere, and smiles no longer seemed rehearsed for appearances alone. Naomi carefully stood from the table, holding her lunchbox with both hands just as she had carried it into the estate that evening. The difference was not the lunchbox itself. The difference was the way every eye now looked upon it. What had once been treated as something worthy of ridicule had quietly become a reminder of discipline, sacrifice, and love. Before returning to her duties, Naomi thanked Adrian with genuine gratitude. "You did not have to do any of this for me," she said softly. Adrian offered a calm smile that carried years of experience rather than authority. "No," he replied. "I did it for everyone else." Naomi looked at him with quiet curiosity. Adrian glanced around the ballroom, where guests were now speaking to servers with noticeably greater kindness. Sometimes people forget what respect looks like until someone is willing to show it first. Naomi nodded slowly, understanding that the evening had become larger than either of them. It was never really about a lunchbox. It had been about the invisible value carried by every honest person whose story was never judged fairly at first glance. As the final guests prepared to leave, several paused to shake Naomi's hand. Others thanked her personally for her service instead of walking past without noticing her. The gentleman who had apologized earlier wished her mother good health after learning about her from another employee. Even the woman wearing the diamond necklace smiled warmly before quietly saying, "I hope your family enjoys many more dinners together." Naomi thanked each person with the same humility that had defined her long before anyone recognized it. Later that night, after the last limousine disappeared beyond the estate gates and the ballroom lights began to dim, Naomi gathered her belongings and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The city skyline glowed in the distance beneath a sky filled with quiet stars. She sat for a brief moment on a stone bench near the front entrance before beginning the drive home. Resting beside her was the same stainless steel lunchbox she had packed before sunrise. It looked exactly as it had that morning, scratched by years of faithful use and polished with patient care. Yet somehow it seemed brighter now, not because the metal had changed, but because the meaning attached to it had finally been seen. Inside the mansion, Adrian remained alone for a few minutes after everyone had gone. He walked into his private office, opened the cedar chest resting beneath the window, and carefully removed his mother's old lunchbox. He placed it beside the faded photograph from his childhood and gently closed the lid once again. Some memories were never meant to stay hidden forever. Some lessons were too important to leave in the past. Outside, Naomi started her car and smiled as she imagined her mother waiting awake with a warm light glowing in the apartment window. She knew she would tell Evelyn everything that had happened, but somehow the most important part could never be fully explained with words. Respect had not been given to her because of sympathy, wealth, or influence. It had been recognized because character eventually speaks louder than appearances. And on that quiet evening, surrounded by luxury that could impress almost anyone, an ordinary lunchbox reminded an extraordinary room that the greatest measure of a person will never be found in what they carry, but in how they choose to carry themselves. And that day, everyone remembered what dignity truly looks like.